Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the special relationship between Israel and the United States. On Tuesday, April 25th, when the United States House of Representatives passed Res. 311, it was more than a salute to Israel on her 75th birthday. It was a solid, resounding show of support for the Jewish state. It was the proverbial pat on the back from 400 U.S. representatives. It was a sign that things are not as bad as we're being led to believe between Jerusalem and Washington, D.C. A vote of 400 to 19 in support of Israel during these days says a lot about Israel bashing, is as close to a unanimous vote as any lover of Israel could hope for. Only one Republican voted against the resolution, a staunch isolationist. His name is Congressman Thomas Mazie of Kentucky, and he simply could not vote in favor of the resolution. The 17 other nay voters were, as expected, composed of the entire infamous Progressive Caucus, plus one other, Betty McCollum of Minnesota. It is important to take in the enormity of a vote like this, enormity, especially in light of a very fractionalized Washington, D.C. It was just a few weeks ago when U.S. President Joe Biden publicly dressed down Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that he will not invite the Israeli Prime Minister to the White House anytime soon because D.C. disagrees with Netanyahu's push for judicial reform. And just a few days later, nearly the entire House of Representatives, including, of course, Biden devotees and diehard Democrats, not just Republicans, signifies their support for Israel. Certainly, there are currents and pockets in the halls of U.S. power where Israel is reviled, like the Progressive Caucus. But at this stage, they are a small group with very little influence. They are colorful, and they are loud, and they speak in sound bites. It's very good to put them on the news, but they are not powerful. On the one hand, both in Israel and the United States, the Jewish world is bombarded with examples of how tensions are fraught and support for Israel is waning. We're bombarded with pleas to fight on Israel's behalf and convince others of Israel's value to the United States and to the world. And then along comes Res. 311, proving that the situation is not as bad or as dire as it is portrayed in the Jewish media and the Israeli media. There is a reason for this stark disparity between the message and reality. It's not simply a misread of the political agenda. It is a time-honored strategy of how to motivate and how to raise money for the cause. Crisis is the greatest of all motivational tools. Crisis activates people to get involved. Crisis stimulates contributions. When things are going well, people are complacent. They do not give, not of their time, not of their energy, not of their money. I'm not suggesting that there has not been a decline in the perception of the essential role of Israel and the special relationship between Israel and the United States. It's just not as bad as it is often portrayed. There's the difference there. And it's all laid out clearly in the resolution. Res. 311 proclaims 4 important U.S. policies. It encourages deepening U.S. Israel cooperation on every level, especially security. It encourages expansion of the Abraham Accords, and it wishes Israel a happy 75th birthday. Quote, encouraging the expansion and strengthening of Abraham Accords, to urge other nations to normalize relations with Israel and ensure that existing agreements reap tangible security and economic benefits for the citizens of those countries and all peoples in the region, unquote. It encourages the United States and Israel to continue to deepen and expand bilateral cooperation across the full spectrum of economic, security, and civilian issues. It also expresses continued support for security assistance to Israel as outlined in the United States-Israel Memorandum of Understanding to ensure that Israel can defend itself by itself. And finally, the memorandum, the Resolution 311, that is, also calls for support of, quote, Israel's robust involvement as an active member of the community of nations to benefit Israel and the United States as partners who share common values and a commitment to democracy. Every 5 years, Congress passes a resolution similar to this resolution. This year's was a little different. This year's resolution did not mention the two-state solution with the Palestinians. In fact, in this resolution, there is no mention at all of the Palestinians. And while it does mention the countries in the region with whom Israel has agreements, like Egypt and Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, interestingly, it does not mention the 1993 Oslo Accords with the Palestinian Authority. There was a draft of the proposed language that was, in the end, not put into this resolution. That draft is very similar to the previous resolution supporting Israel, and it read, a negotiated settlement leading to a sustainable two-state solution with the democratic Jewish state of Israel and the demilitarized democratic Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. That was the language, very simple, very boilerplate, and was used earlier. Some Democratic representatives wanted this language and wrote a letter to that effect. The important point here is that when that language was not incorporated into H-Res 311, the Democrats did not walk back their support. Republicans in Congress, like the vast majority of Israelis, simply do not have faith in the Palestinians as partners at this stage. And despite all their disagreements and differences in Washington on so many different issues, Democrats and Republicans joined together in their support of Israel in their 75th anniversary. That is telling. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Wall Street Journal. The column was published online on April 27th and in print on April 28th. It's entitled, When Theodor Herzl Met the Pope, and it's authored by Yossi Levine, the rabbi of the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. This is how Levine begins. Theodor Herzl, father of modern Zionism, traveled to the Vatican in January 1904 to plead his case to Pope Pius X. Months earlier, in the Russian Empire, scores of Jews had been murdered in what became known as the Kishinev pogrom. The Jews of Europe needed a refuge. Herzl argued that Palestine, then under Ottoman rule, was the logical homeland of the Jewish people. Levine describes their conversation and explains that by listening carefully and rolling with the flow, Herzl deftly wins over the pontiff. In the end, Herzl not only quickly thought on his feet, he created a policy vis-a-vis the church that is in place to this very day. And the column continues. The Pope promised to help. If you come to Palestine and settle your people there, we shall have churches and priests ready to baptize all of you. Needless to say, this wasn't the response for which Herzl had been hoping. In further conversation, however, the Jewish statesman revealed something important about his vision of how Jews and Christians would coexist in the Holy Land. As the self-appointed representative of the people who had been stateless for 1,800 years, Herzl understood the realpolitik of his time. To allay the Pope's concerns about what would become of churches and holy sites, he invoked the doctrine of extraterritoriality. Even in the Jewish state, such sacred places as Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth would sit outside Jewish jurisdiction, perhaps even under the protection of the Holy See. Herzl was a dreamer, but also an arch pragmatist. His imagined state would be hospitable to all comers, Jews and Gentiles alike. It's no accident that Israel's Declaration of Independence announces that the state will safeguard the holy places of all religions, a kindness that hadn't been extended to Judaism prior to the nation's founding. Levine now offers a wonderful example of how Herzl embraced people from different backgrounds, even within the Jewish world. He writes, Herzl practiced what he preached. An acculturated German-speaking Jew, he was not observant. Yet, on the eve of the Second Zionist Congress in 1898, Herzl went to synagogue in Basel. Anticipating that he'd be called to recite the blessing, known to all traditional Jews, he asked a friend to help him learn the liturgy. The few Hebrew words of the blessing caused me more anxiety than my welcoming and closing address and the whole direction of the proceedings, he confessed in his diary. Attending a Shabbat service wasn't simply good politics. It was good relationship building. He appreciated the value of showing solidarity with religious Jews, a group that was a tiny island in the sea of secular Zionism. One of the most successful dimensions of modern Zionism is that it has brought together Jews from all over the world. In Hebrew, the expression is kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Jews came and still come from all over the world, bringing their cultures and traditions with them to Israel. It was Herzl's dream. This is how Levine concludes. Herzl believed it was possible for the state to embrace a universalistic ethic even as it remained particularistic. The founders, several decades later, concurred. Israel's Declaration of Independence doesn't name liberty, justice, and peace as the nation's values, but liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets. The best of Jewish and democratic values were meant to reinforce each other. Nostalgia won't be enough to extract Israel from its current morass. That will take political courage, a spirit of compromise, and the conviction that peaceful coexistence is possible. If Herzl could dream a Jewish state into reality, surely his heirs can set it on a path that would make the prophets proud. Thank you, Rabbi Levine, for reminding us of a very cogent moment in Zionist history and for bringing us a very important essay about unity. Next up is an editorial from the Jerusalem Post published on April 30th, 2023. It's entitled, "World Rugby's Decision Allowing Disinvitation of Israel is Unsporting." Editorial. Subtitle, "World Rugby's Decision Sets a Bad Precedent that should raise a red flag in the arena of international diplomacy." With this editorial, the Jerusalem Post is responding to a very disturbing event, a sporting event to which Israel was disinvited. The event we are speaking about is an international rugby tournament in South Africa. Israeli players were disinvited because the tournament organizers were intimidated by BDS, and so they revoked the Israeli invitation. This is how the editorial begins. World Rugby, the sport's global governing body, has ruled that the decision by the South African Rugby Union, SARU, is to disinvite an Israeli team, Tel Aviv Heat, from an international competition last month was not discriminatory. World Rugby's decision sets a bad precedent and compounds the unsporting move by SARU that should raise a red flag not just in the world of sport, but also in the arena of international diplomacy. Let's first review the sequence of events. SARU announced on February 3rd that the Tel Aviv Heat team was no longer invited to the March 24th competition called 2023 Mansi Challenge. The decision came following pressure from the South African BDS coalition, an affiliate of the Palestinian BDS National Committee that promotes the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Israel pushed hard, by the way, to have the decision reconsidered, but it all fell on deaf ears. The tournament organizers were not interested. Worse, they collapsed under the threat of violence, and that's where a real problem emerges. The editorial continues. Calls to reverse the decision, despite BDS threats, fell on deaf ears, and the tournament proceeded without the Israeli team. Shortly after the tournament, however, following an investigation into the Israel Rugby Union's complaint, World Rugby ruled that SARU decision had been made due to threats of violence, according to a March 29th letter obtained by the JTA. In the letter, World Rugby noted the public reaction to inviting an Israeli team to South Africa included a statement by the BDS coalition claiming that SARU would, quote, have blood on its hands, unquote, if Tel Aviv Heat participated. The Jerusalem Post concludes, calling this entire episode a real stain on South Africa and their heroic leader Nelson Mandela. They write, Jewish organizations were right to blow the whistle, slamming the rulings by both SARU and World Rugby. Schweitz summed it up well. Rugby is a game divorced from politics, he said, explaining that the idea is to play the game hard and then shake hands when it's finished. Bringing politics into the game is contrary to the rugby ethos. We still have not seen tangible evidence of credible and significant threats to public safety. We haven't seen any evidence that SARU or South African security services analyzing those threats before making this decision, said Tel Aviv Heat CEO Pete Sickle. In 1995, Nelson Mandela demonstrated how sports in general, and rugby in particular, could bring people together when he orchestrated a show of unity after South Africa's victory in the Rugby World Cup over New Zealand. Beautifully captured in the films Invictus, World Rugby and SARU have shamed Mandela's legacy. Here's what the South African Rugby Union and World Rugby do not understand. Their role and responsibility is not to buckle under threats, but to work with law enforcement to ensure safety and arrest those who threaten violence. By succumbing to the threats, they are inviting new threats. And the lesson is that all one needs to do is threaten violence, and events will be canceled. Thugs will get their way, and the world will be held captive by terrorists. Those who issued the threats should have been investigated, arrested, and tried. This was cowardice on the part of World Rugby. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 8 cartoons and headlines and memes today. There have been quite a bit of topsy-turvy things in the news lately. This meme makes fun of 2 huge news events. The reality is that almost every political cartoon over the past 2 weeks has dealt with these 2 subjects, and only these 2 subjects. This is one of the funniest. A nurse says, "Sir, you've been in a coma for 1 month." And the patient responds, "Oh boy, I can't wait to watch Tucker tonight with an ice-cold Bud Light." That's hilarious. Of course, you fall asleep for a moment and you miss those 2 events and the world is different. This next meme is so true. There's been a big push for doing away with vehicles that run on gas and replacing them with electric vehicles. Even big 18-wheeler rigs that should be electric. But there's simply no or little infrastructure to actually accommodate the switch. This meme depicts an electric truck on the back of a flatbed truck being hauled down the highway, and the caption reads, "The quickest way for an electric truck to travel across Wyoming," on a flatbed truck being towed. Next up are a series of headlines, each very funny in their own right, not connected to one another at all. This first headline is about the chair of the Federal Reserve who was duped. 2 Russian comedians called the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, and recorded their conversation as a part of a humor routine. They made believe they were Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. The headline reads, "Russian pranksters dupe Fed chair Jerome Powell into recording call. Pair of comedians posed as Ukraine's president in a conversation earlier this year." It happens actually more than you can imagine. You get the private number and you make the call. Next headline will not shock anyone who lives in a large city in the US. It reads, "Americans are buying more marijuana than chocolate." The smell on the streets of Manhattan can attest to the truth of that headline. Everywhere you go, there's the smell of pot. Almost no candy wrappers on the ground, just the smell of pot. This next headline is typical of universities today. There is a self-destructive nature to them. In this case, the headline reads, "College debate teams comes out against debate." The article following this headline asserts that the teams believe that debate is intrinsically racist. The notion of debate. Arguments. Okay. This next meme is a play on the TV news item that reads, "Man shot after throwing shoe at roach." The meme responds by commenting, "You know it's a rough neighborhood when even the roaches are packing heat." Of course, what really happened is that he threw the shoe, which missed the roach, and instead hit a loaded pistol that went off. That's funny. For decades, there's been a running debate in homes across America. Which way should the toilet paper roll? Actually, should the roll of toilet paper roll? But that gets a little confusing. Should it roll out or should it roll in? In this case, the Black Knight solves the debate, saying this way. Of course, you can't really tell because of where it is, but that's interesting nonetheless. We have all been shocked and disappointed at how potato chip companies fill, or rather don't fill, their bags of chips. Most fill them about a third full, and on Passover, even less. It's a huge frustration and disappointment when you open the bag and you look inside and there's so few chips inside. In this meme, a Lay's potato chip tractor trailer was blown over by a huge gust of wind. And the meme reads, "Chip truck blows over on highway." And then the meme comments, "This would not happen if they filled the bags up." How true that is. Simply how true that is. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the subject of judicial reform at the start of a weekly cabinet meeting. In his remarks, the Prime Minister said that, quote, "We have a fundamental debate about the reform, but we are making an effort to resolve it through negotiations. I believe in the goodwill of both sides. I'm convinced that agreements can be reached, and I give it my full backing," unquote. Regarding security tensions, Netanyahu continued and said, and I'm quoting again, "We will not allow Iran to wrap a stranglehold of terrorism around us. We will act against the aggression of Iran and its terrorist affiliates. In addition, we will establish a national guard and provide a budget to add more police officers to restore personal security to citizens," unquote. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez drew criticism from Israeli officials, especially the Foreign Ministry, over recording and posting a video message in support of the protest movement against judicial reform in Israel. The text of his message reads, "Dear Israeli friends, we as Socialist International have always fought for freedom, equality, justice, and democracy. Yet as many of you already know, these are values that we cannot take for granted and that we have to promote and defend on a daily basis." In English, Sanchez said, "As such, now, as always, the Socialist Internationalist stands in solidarity with the people of Israel. Dear friends, you will always find us in the fight for democracy." Well, Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen took exception to the message. His response was, and I'm quoting here again, "For the opponents of the reforms, there are no red lines, including the attempt to harm Israel's international status. No foreign entity will decide for the Israeli public, and I'm sure that Sanchez had no such intention. As someone who supports the reform, I have no doubt that it will strengthen democracy and balance out authority," unquote. Now, no matter what your stance is on judicial reform in Israel, it's very hard for me to fathom the Prime Minister of another country weighing in on Israel's internal debate. It is simply chutzpah, especially so because not long ago Sanchez decried an effort for judicial reform in his own country. Chutzpah, just plain chutzpah. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi visited Damascus at the official invitation of the Syrian president for a, quote, "very important," unquote, 2-day visit. State media reported all of this. IRNA, state news media in Iran, quoted Hossein Akbari, Iran's ambassador to Syria, who spoke in advance of the visit and said, "Dr. Raisi's trip to Damascus next Wednesday is a very important trip due to the changes and developments that are taking place in the region. This trip will not only be beneficial for Tehran and Damascus, but it is also a very good event that other countries in the region can also take advantage of." This visit to Syria comes at a time when both Syria and Iran are being welcomed into the greater Arab fold, and we are witnessing the establishment of friendly ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two countries that have long considered each other their arch enemy. Also watching Iran's diplomatic expansion is the leader of the Lebanese terror group Hassan Nasrallah, who recently met with Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian and his delegation. Their discussion centered on the latest developments in Lebanon and Israel, and on the Iranian-Saudi agreement and its effect on other countries in the region. A dual Lebanese-Belgian citizen accused by the United States of financing Lebanon's Hezbollah has been extradited from Romania and now faces charges of evading sanctions as well as money laundering. The case is in Brooklyn Federal Court. Mohammed Bazi, whom prosecutors say has provided millions of dollars to Hezbollah, was arrested in February on charges of covertly selling real estate he owned in Michigan and transferring the funds abroad to the coffers of Hezbollah in violation of U.S. sanctions laws. The Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Republican Representative Kevin McCarthy, was greeted by Speaker of the Knesset Amir Ohana at the start of his visit to Israel. McCarthy, as the head of a delegation of 16 companies and members of Congress, both Republican and Democratic, Israel's Knesset is the first legislature in the world in which McCarthy has made an official visit since taking office. Speaking before the Knesset, McCarthy said, "It is an honor for us to join you in Jerusalem to celebrate Israel's independence. In the next 75 years, our important partnership promises to be even stronger than the first 75. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that chutzpah is actually derived from a Hebrew word? Chatzaf means brazen or insolence. The word is found in the Mishnah and the Gemara many times, even as chutzpah is, just as we use it today. But it is mostly thought of as a Yiddish word. Leo Rostin, in his spectacular classic called The Joys of Yiddish, defines chutzpah as gall, brazen nerve, effrontery, incredible guts, presumption plus arrogance, such as no other word and no other language can do justice to. In this sense, chutzpah expresses both a strong disapproval and condemnation. In the same work, Rostin also defines the term as that quality enshrined in a man who, having killed his mother and father, throws himself on the mercy of the court because he is an orphan. Today, chutzpah has made it into American English. It's a common expression in everyday language. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.